So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Silicon Valley at Home's Affordable Housing Month Policy Series panel on the cost of housing development. Really thank you for joining us. I am Leslie Corselia. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley at Home. And we're excited that this event is part of our annual Affordable Housing Month in Silicon Valley, where we have over 50 events and activities throughout the month that highlight the important work that we do with our community partners on affordable housing throughout Santa Clara County and regionally as well. This year's theme is Silicon Valley is Home, and it's dedicated to our community. Whether our families have lived here for generations or are just settling in, Silicon Valley is where we live, and we want our neighbors to have access to a safe, stable, and affordable home. There is no better time to solidify your Houser status and support this critical work than today by becoming a Silicon Valley at Home member and a supporter, and the information is there on the slide. I think we will also be including that in the chat in case you miss it right now. We also want to highlight all of our wonderful sponsors who make Affordable Housing Month possible. You can see our title sponsors, Google, Microsoft, and LinkedIn. But we have many other partners and sponsors and really appreciate all that they've done to make this possible. Before we begin, we'd like to highlight several elected officials and their representatives who are joining us today. We have Alex Kobayashi from the Office of Senator Josh Becker, David Fernandez from the Office of Supervisor Susan Ellenberg, Cooper Tino Councilmember Hung Wei, Gilroy Councilmember Rebecca Armendariz, Gilroy Councilmember Zach Hilton, Mountain View Vice Mayor Lucas Ramirez, Palo Alto Councilmember Allison Cormack, City of Santa Clara Councilmember Kathy Watanabe, Sunnyvale Councilmember Elisa Cineras. We would really like to ask anybody who we did not name to please put your name and affiliation city in the chat so that we can thank you for being here today. Also, for everybody who's online, if at any point during the presentation you have questions, please just add them to the chat and we will get to those at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rob Reinhardt, who's Senior Vice President of Bank of America, today's event sponsors. We really thank the bank for all of its support for affordable housing and also for the work of Silicon Valley at Home. So Rob, it's all yours.
Thank you, Leslie, and welcome everyone to today's panel. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Affordable Housing Month, and affordable housing is very important to us. In 2020, we grew our commitment to $5.9 billion to build and preserve 13,000 affordable housing units across the country. And that's about 1.9 billion went to the West Coast, with the bulk of that going to California, and including the Bay Area. So, and just to put that into perspective a little bit more, during the crisis, this global pandemic health crisis that we're in, we grew our commitment by 20%. So we grew it by $1 billion. And so you might say, well, why does Bank of America care so much about affordable housing? It's really that we really believe it's important to reinvest in the communities that we serve. And the bank and all of us at the bank, understand the challenges that families and individuals face when they don't have a place they can call home and a stable roof over their head. So with that, Affordable Housing Month gives us at the bank an opportunity with Silicon Valley at Home to engage with stakeholders and the public over these critical issues that we're all facing with housing, and especially affordable housing. And I can't think of this topic being more timely, as I've heard from so many local agencies and also clients and developers around the Bay who have had many projects in the works for many years, suddenly, unfortunately put on hold. And this is related to escalating construction costs, number one, but also some more recent developments with critical financing that's through bonds that are distributed through and allocated from the Treasury's office we're seeing could really significantly impact reduction in housing production and preservation that's so critically needed here in our backyard and in the Bay Area. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Libby Seifel. You probably know she's the founder and president of Seifel Consulting, a strategic economic consulting firm that advises public agencies, developers, and property owners on planning, development, and financing of complex infill projects. So with that, Libby, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate that introduction, and thanks so much to Bank of America for increasing your commitment to affordable housing and housing generally. Thank you. Well, today we're thrilled to have a stellar panel talking about the cost of housing in Silicon Valley, which is one of the biggest challenges we face here and throughout California. While we're going to talk about these many challenges, we're going to focus on strategies to bring down the cost of housing and make it more affordable for everyone. And particularly, we're going to focus on what the panelists are doing today to try to do that in real time. With the economy in flux due to COVID-19, now more than ever, we need creative solutions to cut costs and speed up development. And today we're going to focus on 5 key factors that affect the cost of housing. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great, David, thank you. And these 5 cost factors are attributable to key components of the development process: property and the approvals associated with getting a property entitled, the design of a building or a set of buildings for housing, the funding of housing, which includes both the equity capital on the private side often, as well as the financing like the B of A provides, the construction costs, which Rob just referenced, which is usually about 50%, if not more, of the cost of building a home. And then operations, which we often don't talk about, which is equally as important to making sure that we can keep the cost of housing affordable. These represent 5 major components of the development cycle that's required to build a home. As you can see from the flow chart of the development process at the bottom, the process is not for the faint of heart. It's complex and often filled with twists and turns, including unexpected events such as COVID. This is why I'm particularly grateful to all of our 3 panelists for their tireless and courageous work to build more housing in Silicon Valley and throughout California. And our expert panel includes Mia Kang, Senior Vice President of Related California, who I believe we're going to spotlight now and maybe take the slide down. And then, great. Again, Mia works at Related California, a major builder in housing, including affordable housing and mixed income housing throughout the state of California. Linda Mandolini, who is the president of Eden Housing, a nonprofit housing developer based in the Bay Area who develops throughout Silicon Valley and California. And Jonathan Fern, Senior Director of Development at Graystar, a major national firm that develops housing across the United States. We're going to begin with a panel discussion, and then, as Leslie said earlier, when we have about 10 to 15 minutes remaining, we're going to let the panelists answer questions from all of you. So please write your questions to the panelists in the chat window, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can during the limited time that we have. And as you'll see, this is a great panel with a lot of skills and opinions. No dearth of opinions. So I'm sure there's going to be a lively discussion, and I'm likely going to have to cut them short as we try to progress through our 5 topics. So with that, I'm going to start with property and approvals. And I'm going to direct my first question to Mia, and then the rest of the panelists are going to be jumping in at the end. So Mia, not only do you work tirelessly at Related to get more housing built, but you're also working on legislation at the state level to make it easier for everyone to build housing. And you have worked on that in the past, as have Jonathan and Linda. What do you think are the best solutions that have been passed or on the horizon for making it easier, faster, and cheaper to build housing on both the public and private side of the equation?
Great question, Libby. Thank you. And thank you so much to SV Home and Leslie and others for inviting me here today. It's a great panel and timely conversation. The cost of housing, as we all know, just continues to skyrocket. I think we're seeing right now unfounded construction pricing. This reminds me back in the day when the Olympics were being built in China, when you couldn't hold a single bid for more than a week. So it's just one more unpredictable thing affordable housing developers have to contend with. But I think one of the most successful and transformative pieces of legislation that has recently been passed is SB 35. So as far as streamlining and getting back to project approvals, it has been my experience now doing it a couple of different times for different purposes. The SB 35 piece of legislation has absolutely streamlined project approvals, making everyone come to the table a lot easier. It's an organizing tool that we've been able to successfully utilize at Related. And one example is a project that we recently were selected in South Lake Tahoe. One of the governor's initiatives, the executive order for surplus sites for the state to develop on land. And this was an 11-acre parcel in South Lake Tahoe. We actually have two regulatory agencies, the TRPA, which is by state, Nevada, California, and the federal government, and South Lake Tahoe, which is a small urbanized town. Because it was an urbanized area in Tahoe in El Dorado County, we were able to utilize SB 35. And we expedited all of our project approvals. And for an 11-acre site, the largest ever single residential development ever approved in Tahoe, we were fully approved from both the city of South Lake Tahoe and TRPA in less than 3 months. 248 apartments, 100% affordable. So it was a game changer. It really surprised a lot of folks, but it gave us an opportunity also to have a lot of meetings and public outreach. And so it's really how you utilize the tool. We were able to utilize the tool to expedite things, but at the same time, not cut the community process. So with that, we always had support. And for the hearings that we did have, we had really been able to incorporate a lot of feedback and get a lot of support from the community. So, I believe that's one of the biggest game changers. I think as far as some of the bills coming forward this year, we're looking at, we are supporting the Grayson bill, which looks at impact fees, streamlining some impact fees. I think that's another issue that's very important, especially if you're building denser, smaller units in an urban infill setting. Oftentimes impact fees are very hard and challenging to get through. So there's a lot of work to be done, but at least there are some good tools now that in our tool chest that we are actively utilizing for streamlining. There's still room for improvement on all of these bills. And we're looking forward to continued work and partnership to get that done. Thanks.
Thank you. And Linda, did you want to add about your personal experience with SB 35 as well?
So we have a similar experience to Related on SB 35. We just entitled a permanent supportive housing project in Vallejo in record time. The other bill that I would point out that we have found to be of significant impact on time to get approved. And for folks who don't understand why time matters, every year that elapses, our pricing goes up between 5 and 10%. This year notwithstanding, because lumber prices are just completely out of control. So if you can get entitled in under a year, it makes a huge difference for a project. And so SB 330, which was Nancy Skinner's bill that limited the number of public hearings for projects to 5, has actually been a significant game changer for projects where we are not SB 35 eligible. And so I would give a shout out to the state for creating sort of more paths to exemption and speedier entitlements, because I think it's really saving us money.
And Jonathan, do you want to add anything to this part of the discussion before we move on to design?
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of echo certainly what Linda said about SB 330. That's certainly something that we have been using and has been extraordinarily helpful, not only for just kind of limiting the number of hearings, but also just kind of laying out kind of the expected path forward, for both the city and the applicant, I think is very powerful. I also say that not to be understated are the changes to the state density bonus law that allow for increased flexibility for projects. I mean, a lot of things that we go through, we're stuck on kind of one thing, whether it be parking or a setback, so on and so forth, which we used to require a zoning change or zoning amendment or something like that. And now with the flexibility in the state density bonus law, that actually helps projects kind of be able to morph a little better to existing rules. So those two items.
Great. Well, I'm going to keep you on the spot, Jonathan, as we move on to design. So as Graystar is designing new housing developments, what strategies are you using to reduce costs and pave the way for the use of construction technology, which we'll talk about more when we get to the construction part?
Yeah, I think design, for folks that are building, projects, what we call medium high density projects, typically the same around, between, market rate developers and nonprofits. I mean, what you really want to do is create, obviously, an efficient building as possible. It gets more and more challenging, obviously, as sites get to be harder and harder, just from the way that they're shaped or whatever. There's not really many flat, rectangular lots anymore. But we try to obviously have efficiency in our design. One thing that we always look at and try to right size, Mia's working on that with 1401, is parking. Really being able to really not build more parking than is absolutely necessary is key. To give an example, I'm building a project now where we are in a water table, having to go down multiple levels, and that's making our parking costs $90,000 to $100,000 per space. So it just gets to be tremendously expensive. So that's why it's really important to have flexibility around these kind of things like parking and setbacks and height, because you never know when you might need it, and you never know when it can really be a lifesaver from a cost perspective.
Yeah, and Mia, can you just build on this? Because I know you've worked a lot on parking requirements to reduce them. What do you see on the horizon with respect to that?
Sure, thanks. And yes, as there is a bill at work. One of the co-sponsors is the Council of Infill Builders that both myself and Jonathan are also on the board of. So thanks to all of our work as we kind of move forward as a team, but it's a co-sponsorship between the California YIMBYs as well as Spur and Abundant Housing LA. And it's, again, looking at statewide parking reform to eliminate minimum parking requirements for all development, including housing, but including commercial, in any new development or existing development within a half mile of high quality transit. And right now that definition is at 15-minute headway. So it's those transit priority areas, but by eliminating minimum parking requirements, you absolutely will reduce the cost of housing. Allowing, it's not really a recipe for all development to have zero parking. It's really just to right size the parking so that, the development pencils, that it's the right kind of development. It fits with the size of the project, the size of the units, and hopefully it also opens the door to that missing middle housing, that housing that but for the parking requirements could actually work. And so back in the old days in San Francisco or any of these places, Victorian homes or apartment buildings, they didn't have on-site parking. Everyone parked on the street. And so really that is our missing middle housing today. So I think if we start getting back to sort of right sizing the parking, we will be able to hopefully bring down the cost of housing. And of course, also at the same time, there are a lot of folks that actually don't own cars and they're renting apartments with a parking space. Some of our research has shown that parking space can add, about $400 to the cost of rent. So if we can start to, lower the cost of rent for renters that don't have cars and be able to provide choice so folks can walk and be in places that have different mobility options, it will actually get us to the place where we can start to reduce GHG and start to live a more sustainable sort of environment. But one of the other things that I think is really interesting is we had to deep dive a little bit on inclusionary housing and parking requirements. And I just wanted to share some data. The Council of Infill Builders, along with our co-sponsors, are going to be publishing a couple of reports. And we just found it to be very, very interesting. Back in 2016, the city of San Diego actually modified their density bonus law and kind of added some more flexibility, and it increased production a little bit. But in 2019, the city of San Diego actually eliminated all minimum parking requirements for all housing, market rate and affordable, for all transit priority areas in San Diego. And the housing production exploded in San Diego almost overnight, to the point where the affordable housing production was 6 times over in prior years before the change, decoupling parking. And for market rate housing, these are those units that are actually subsidizing those affordable units. Remember, the state's not putting a dime in these units. Those units went up 5 times. So we're seeing that by eliminating these minimum parking requirements and providing developers with flexibility, it actually boosts housing production. So, you know, we hope that we can see that statewide. San Diego has led. We're also hoping that this can be an incentive for small business. So, you know, as we all know, COVID has hit restaurants really tough. We've got restaurants that have, you know, utilized parking spaces for their outdoor dining. Right now, that's illegal. But it, you know, if this bill passes, all of these businesses can actually legally turn those empty outdoor parking spaces into something more useful, as well as the plethora of existing buildings with lots of empty parking spaces, as we all know, could actually start to transform into something different. So anyway, we're excited about that possibility and a few other bills that are making their way through the legislature this year. Thanks.
Great. So I'm going to move us on to funding, because I know we're going to want to talk about this for a while, but we can always come back to some of these other topics. And I'm just going to encourage you to please go ahead and ask your questions in the chat as we're going along, and we'll get to them at the end, as we said. So Linda, as Eden continually seeks to put together the Dagwood sandwich of multi-layered funding sources that's required for affordable housing, you know, what are you seeing as the strategies to make funding easier to get? I know it's actually getting harder in some cases, but what are you optimistic about?
Well, you know, I'm optimistic about the local commitments. You know, we're here in Silicon Valley, and just a shout out to SV at Home and to Santa Clara County for their huge leadership on funding affordable housing in this geography, and also to San Jose, right? We have a lot of local resources that are really, frankly, helping us move the meter in a fairly substantial way in Silicon Valley. San Mateo had a ballot initiative, Alameda County had a ballot initiative. So that's been really heartening. You know, the governor just made his announcement yesterday with billions of dollars for housing in it. And so I think in that way, it's very heartening. In fact, we had that ballot, Props 1 and 2, that created so much money that we didn't have enough federal resources to pair with it. So we're now working at both the state and federal level to think about, you know, how do we get enough resources to move the many projects that have funding commitments at the state and local level that are not able to secure tax credits at the federal level. And I would just say, you know, the Turner Center did a really interesting study about the impact of funding sources on cost. And they showed that for every separate source that you use, you're adding 2 to 4% to the cost of developing the project. And I think this is really instructive for all of us, and that there really needs to be some thinking about how do we streamline funding. And so we've been working with the California Housing Consortium and the governor to talk about, you know, could some of the money in the governor's budget, and he proposed about 1.7 billion, just be used to directly fund projects that have commitments from the state, to just get them done, rather than do this really complicated structure that we all love, which is to sort of get some throughput. I think for permanent supportive housing, this is actually really a very smart way to think about how to do this. But I also think, you know, you go to source A in 2020, source B in 2021, and source C in 2022. So that adds cost, because you're waiting a year for each of those funding rounds to commit to you. And I do think there needs to be some commitment at the state level to better streamlining how we commit to affordable housing in particular. And I think, you know, for the for-profit sector, it's a little easier because they use equity and they use debt they don't necessarily have to go out and find 27 different entities to fund their projects. So I think for us, this is super important, just to really streamline funding. We are very heartened by the amount of funding we're seeing and the commitment that we're seeing coming out of a lot of our elected officials. So I think that's been the really bright light in all of this. Problem is the costs are going up, and every commitment has different kinds of requirements, all of which add more cost. So you're just trying to balance everybody's public objectives with our goal of building housing. We have more than 20,000 households on our waiting list right now for 10,000 homes. In one day in a project in Fremont, we got 800 applications for 71 units. So the demand is fairly substantial on the lower end of the spectrum right now.
And Mia and Jonathan, would you like to talk about any other funding strategies that you think are going to be helpful on both the private and the public side?
Jonathan, you're on mute.
No, I'm just thinking to myself. Go ahead. If you go ahead, Mia. I was just thinking.
Okay, well, of course we are, anticipating and optimistic and praying for the infrastructure plan at the federal level. I am, optimistically hopeful that California will have a significant opportunity to sort of reshape certain things and begin to think about infrastructure a little bit differently. So I'm excited about that possibility just in general to see where that's going to take us. But I do hope that, as was pointed out by Rob earlier in the conversation and Linda, this whole notion of the tax credit and bond financing, it has absolutely become a significant barrier to getting housing done. And, and for a lot of the local officials who are supporting us, who are getting funding, who are, literally pulling together every last, quarter in the couch cushions to kind of make these projects happen, can't secure the tax credits for one reason or another, because the priorities are misaligned. And, and I think some of the challenges are that there are so many priorities and they all do not align. And so there really needs to be sort of another way that we filter through these projects to make sure that we can get more done. So I'm hopeful that some conversations are happening in the legislature this year, that maybe there's going to be some movement around potentially a one-stop shop. I personally would support streamlining, and I would support what Linda said about the added costs for each of the subsidy sources. It is super hard to time these things. And, as we all recall, back in November, HCD put a pause on all the funding. And so we're still working through the pause, which is not fully been lifted yet with the various sources. And that absolutely affects timeline, tax credit schedules, et cetera. So anything we can do to align and streamline and just make it a little bit easier to go through the gauntlet of financing will absolutely reduce cost and will absolutely help us get units on the ground faster.
Yeah, I guess only thing I would add, I mean, to Linda's point, from where I sit, from working in the for-profit sector, it's just a lot easier, quite frankly. I mean, it hasn't been over the last, let's just say, 12 months, 12 to 14 months, but historically it's just been easier. I think, where I kind of get heartened, is just seeing folks think about, flexible ways to utilize funds in ways that haven't really been considered previously. I'm working in the city of Redwood City, and they basically told, developers they don't want the money for the impact fee. Go figure out a way, to put that money to work and actually get units built. And so that's led to some pretty creative partnerships. And I think to Mia's point about the infrastructure bill, it's kind of allowing us to see what's possible. And I think, programs like Project Home Key also have done that as well, have kind of shifted the paradigm, if you will, to see that, oh, we can actually exercise money quickly and do things quickly, where, we weren't kind of thinking about that a year or so ago.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, Libby, I mean, I do think it's cheaper and faster to buy a building than it is to build a building right now, right? And so I think you've seen some interesting models out there where folks are, especially in the middle income, looking to acquire properties and do some conversion because it's just faster. You can buy a building, assuming you can compete for the price of that building, in 90 days, whereas to build something right now on a good day, you're looking at 24 to 36 months. So I think just speed matters. And with Home Key, we think that program was really great, but we do think the program is an interim program. It didn't really come up with a way to for those of us who might be buying some of those properties to really have a good long-term ownership strategy. And so I think it's really important for us to think about, especially for permanent supportive housing, right? You know, you have ADA requirements and all these other things that are permanent requirements that didn't come with the home key money. But it is a great demonstration project. And since I'm on the call with Jonathan and he's on the board of the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley, I do also need to give them a shout out. And give the pre-development financing that the tech companies have created with them a significant shout out. The money from LinkedIn and Apple and Google and those guys has really made it much easier for us to move faster to acquire land. And it is not to be understated how helpful that has been. And so I know the trust has been a real leader on that.
Yes, thanks. And a shout out to them as well. I'm going to move us on to construction, but please, again, put your questions in the chat and we'll be responding to them soon. So Jonathan, we talked about design strategies to address the use of construction technology, but can you speak more about how Graystar and its contractors are deploying construction technology to reduce costs?
Yeah, so it's obviously something that we think about a lot. Construction technology is notoriously slow moving, and that really is because these projects, a typical, let's just say 250 unit project is probably in the $120 million range just in construction costs alone. So the willingness to kind of do something different is tempered because if you're wrong, then it can cause serious problems. But we've looked at modular housing. We have a modular housing kind of division within Graystar, although it's been more active in Europe than it has been in the United States. Really because the modular kind of infrastructure hasn't really been formed yet, and that's really what's a challenge for a lot of the new kind of technologies is that it just hasn't kind of played out yet. And so folks are kind of, waiting to see how it all works. CLT, I think, has really good promise. I think what you see now is, buildings get up to 8 stories and then you don't see anything until 20 stories because it's hard to justify the differential in cost between wood and concrete at 9 and 10 stories. But CLT actually does have the potential to kind of allow folks to make that leap to actually get to more density on a particular site, although it would come with more height, of course. But those type of things I think are out there on the horizon, but we just haven't really gotten into the mainstream yet. We've looked at modular bathrooms and trying to get those mixed in, but I think what you're where kind of the whole industry is going is really more towards more offsite things that are pre-made, prefabbed, and brought onto the site rather than having kind of the traditional stick-built on-site process. So those are some of the things that we are tossing around. But the whole issues around lumber spikes and commodity spikes, those are just bulls everybody just is going to have to try to hold on as best they can as they do their thing.
And Mia, I know Related also does a lot on the construction side and has an in-house construction team. What are you seeing from Related's perspective?
Well, the Tahoe Project is our first significant modular project. So that is where we are going and trying to define sort of where our standards are, how we can kind of make it all work. But as Jonathan and others are saying, not only are we dealing with, kind of this, frankly, different way of building with modular construction. Up in Tahoe, it makes a lot of sense because we have a shorter building season also. But it's the issue too around 100% electric and just dealing with, new energy codes and solar and batteries and how all this stuff starts to balance out. Because our conventional ways of heating hot water with gas, which is pretty much the norm, gas boilers were pretty much what everybody does. Those are no longer what we're looking at doing. So I think taking that first leap, trying to understand what the ongoing operating costs are, what the effect is, and the long-term longevity of the system, I think is one that, we're all sort of grappling with, because there are not a lot of prototypes that we could point to. So I think we're all entering this market cautiously with a lot of research and, and a lot of advice to kind of make the right decisions as we start to construct these buildings. And, and these buildings, each one is custom. Every single thing we do is custom. So there is no off the chart or, off the shelf type of building. So each one has unique constraints. Each one has unique goals. And that's why it makes it harder. So anything we can do to streamline some element of it, whether it's just the unit itself, because at the end of the day, the apartments are pretty much as generic as they can get. I mean, they're functional, they're great, serviceable, meet all the standards, but, and so if we can make those faster, easier, cheaper to deliver on site, we're all game. It's just everything else that makes it hard.
And I think Eden is also exploring construction technology as well, Linda.
We just closed construction financing on our first modular deal with Factory OS in Vallejo. And I would say this, I tried to do my first project with modular when I was 26. I'm now way older than 26. I've had 3 forays into modular prior to this. I've only managed to build some units with one of those previous forays. In both instances, the modular manufacturers went out of business before they could deliver the boxes to us. So, it's interesting. I do a lot of work with the International Housing Partnership, and Vancouver has been doing a huge amount of work in modular. And to Jonathan's point, Europe is doing this, Japan is doing this, Canada is doing this. The United States really has to think about how we stand this industry up. And I think it's really, it really is an idea whose time has come, and it's still, even as of last month, we're like, are we taking too much risk by going in this direction? But we feel very much like you have to really start taking this on. And, we saved a little bit of money, not as much as we would have hoped, but we think that this is really important. We have to advance construction technology. We are in the, and if you look at the tiny home craze, right, there has been a lot of work in these smaller configurations to do a lot of small scale production for homelessness. And it's been very cost effective. Whether it's a good long-term solution is a different question, but it's been a really good near-term solution. But I believe that we have to get this technology there. That's why Eden wanted to do the Factory OS deal. It happened to be in Vallejo, which is where the factory is. So the city was super excited to support their local business. But, we really want to see this technology become, more regularly used, because I think it saves you time. In theory, it saves, if you're in a tough neighborhood, it saves you theft. It saves you a lot of things that are kind of intangible. It saves you money on interest savings as well. So, and it's safer working conditions. You're not working outside. It's great. So hopefully more of us will start using it.
It brings workforce in. Oh, sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I know Linda's heard me say this before too, but and Mia kind of brought it up with the missing middle. There's 2 ways to think of missing middle. There's the income spectrum of who those households are, but there's also the housing product type. And I always say, as somebody who builds high density housing, we really do have to focus on the fact that it's just an inherently expensive product type to build. And that's why we really need to explore allowing other product types to be built. So, duplexes, quadplexes, things that are just inherently less expensive than these high density buildings that we are all building, because they are just, what I always say is we're all building Teslas and nobody is questioning why aren't we building Hondas and Fords and things of that nature. And largely because they have been zoned out. So, kudos to a lot of cities around who are exploring allowing, opportunity housing where they previously has not been allowed, but we need to allow for a diversity of housing product type to be built. It should not all be one product type and one type of developer that's doing it.
Well, and on building on that, and I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on this, is accessory dwelling units and getting the approval process in place so that you have pre-approved plans and something that would allow modular construction to occur on, it has to be an area where that is allowed, by the sites themselves. But that's another area, I think, of exploration. I know you've been working on ADUs as well, Jonathan. I mean, not in your day job, in your night job, promoting more housing production. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so yeah, this is great. This is a great discussion, and we're going to go into a little more depth. I see a few of the questions are going to go into more depth, but I want to spend the last bit of time before we go to audience questions on operations, because we often overlook operations. And Linda, as you know, operations, keeping those annual property management, operation, utility costs down, keeps rents more affordable to tenants, and helps you leverage more private and public debt to finance housing. So what is Eden doing, given your long history in managing properties, to reduce operational costs?
Well, we actually have been all about green in operations. In fact, we have a fairly high standard for new construction for building green in our buildings, but we actually have been tackling our older buildings. And so we've spent a huge amount of time really on retrofits, getting any incentives we could to bring in better insulation. There's some low hanging fruit out here. Everybody wants solar, but really there's a lot of less expensive ways to save money. Working with our tenants actually on conservation. We saw huge water spikes during COVID because everybody was at home. And so we're seeing, big energy spikes, but we've been really working hard wherever we can. We have a solar array on our roof. We're looking at solar hot water because you can save a lot of money there since we pay for hot water at Eden. So there's a lot of technology out there now. And our test for technology is, we want to invest in it on the front end wherever we can. We want to get incentives. So on the electric hot water, when Mia was talking about that earlier, there's some incentives out there that it's 15% more to build straight up, to build all electric on hot water. But if you get incentives, you can actually reduce the cost. So then the question becomes, will the system last? So if it goes away in 3 years, you're not really saving a lot of money. So, we're at a new frontier for some of these technologies. And so we're trying to learn as we go and spend our money wisely on the front end and save money on the back end. My big worry right now, and I'll just say it out loud, insurance is skyrocketing. We have properties in, pretty much everybody's in or near a fire zone, and that's costing California a lot of money in insurance premiums. All the water districts, many that we work in, are considering higher rate structures right now because of the drought. And it's just, we can't really control some of these costs. And so we're really pushing hard. And then I would just say the other thing that really has an impact on our budgets are the permanent supportive housing set-asides. We're super committed to this work, but this is a higher turnover population in some instances, sometimes hard on the physical plant. And we have to budget up front, sometimes for the services reserves. So we're building into our pro formas the ability to pay for the service coordinator for 15 years so that we can make sure that we have the ability to support the services that those folks need, because we think you won't be as successful without that. So when we look at operating budgets, we look at what can we control, and really try our best to control it. So utilities have been huge, and not just the systems, but the human behavior, and making sure that we know how to run the systems and making sure our tenants really help us maximize our savings. It feels like there's a lot of pressure. And I mean, literally yesterday, we just got a note from one of the counties saying they're going to assess $8,000 a year bills for new fire district controls. And we're just like, okay, we don't, we have to pay that. So it's very challenging to keep up with everything that's coming down the way on ops. And, it helps us to have lower operating costs because we can leverage more debt up front. And unlike Jonathan, I can't raise the rents. So Eden's we're in a, and Mia as well on her affordable, a severely rent constrained environment. So if the costs go up, we're not going to charge our tenants more money. So that's very difficult for us.
So Mia and Jonathan, do you want to add anything on operations? Jonathan, I know you do a lot with your own operations. Graystar has its own unit. Is that something you'd like to talk about, what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think Linda really covered it all. I mean, to be honest, we obviously look, in efficiencies and ways we can staff projects, and I know, we have operations team looking at that, but we have kind of the same challenges. Obviously, we can raise rents, but certainly in all aspects, for the major systems of the building, where that hit the OpEx budget, we try to look at ways that we can, bring those costs down, and, we look at green as well, to try to do that. But yeah, really no kind of secret sauce involved that we're kind of looking at this point in time, but yeah.
And Mia, just to put you a little on the spot, because Related has both the market rate division that does do affordable housing within it, or mixed income housing, and then also the 100% affordable housing. Are you comparing sort of operating costs across those two? And are you doing something in both places to cut costs?
Well, I'm definitely not overseeing the operational side of things.
Right.
And it's really two distinct companies. So market rate just has other inherent costs to it than the affordable. So let's just from the affordable perspective, yes, I think there is an overall kind of view on everything. But, I think exactly what Linda said, we're all sitting here just reeling from surprise cost hikes, new assessments, fees increasing, new fees. You just can't predict it all. I mean, I think, we set up operating reserves, in hopes that we can cover these costs when they spike. But it is about what is the new normal. And I think that's challenging because the new normal constantly changes. And so, but it is, doing everything you can to do upfront to be, efficient and cost effective, and then, really hope that you size the project up for enough, cushions and comfort, but to kind of make things work. But I think one of the challenges with supportive housing, and I've done several supportive housing projects, and Related really is kind of entering into that world, and we've done a few. But I think going forward too, I'm hoping to see a little bit more reform when it comes to perhaps using healthcare dollars for social services. I think they're really, the burden that affordable housing developers have to bear to serve all the various social goods that affordable housing brings to the table really hurts the operating budget. And we've gone way beyond just providing shelter. Also in cases of electric vehicles, we're asked to put in EV charging stations, EV centers for, vehicles that may or may not even be used. But now, the property in many cases has to supply the energy to run people's vehicles. So it's challenging when you look at the amount of requirements that are layered onto not just affordable housing, but housing in California with the various new standards. So it's really, if we want to really take a comprehensive look at reducing costs, we also have to look at all the various requirements. And maybe there's a way to streamline that and prioritize what we're really doing here. So, because really we just can't have it all. The state can't have it all. We can't give you 100% of everything you want in every single housing development. So there really does need to be sort of, some prioritization in terms of cost or production, and meeting certain standards, but not necessarily always exceeding every standard and going for the brass ring every time. I mean, I personally like LEED Silver or LEED Platinum or these wonderful buildings that we build, but not everything has to be a rock star. We can also build really wonderful buildings that are just great, energy efficient, sustainable, and provide great shelter.
Great. Well, very well said. So I'm going to switch to some audience questions that we've got. And this first question is going to take us in a slightly different direction, but more related to funding. Does anyone see project-based vouchers coming back for families or seniors in Silicon Valley, and what will that take?
I don't know when they're coming back. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration, and I think the HUD budget has an increase in vouchers, so I'm hopeful that happens. They are an essential part of the formula to get to the folks on the lowest end of the income spectrum. And so, and it really is all about utilization. And so if the Housing Authority has more voucher capacity, they can do more project basing. And I think that's really the way that gets done is through the federal government. And so if you are not calling your congressperson about this issue, you should be, and really working hard on that. I think the administration is highly sympathetic. It's just really a question of what can they get done. Yeah, Leslie just put up 1,000 new vouchers expected in the chat.
1,000. Awesome. Yeah, I know that the Santa Clara Housing Authority was meeting yesterday to talk about it some, so I'm hopeful that that's on the way, at least from the County of Santa Clara's perspective. So moving on, another question related to funding, and you all talked about this too. Can you just talk a little bit more about SIDLAC bond funding and tax credit allocations, 4% tax credit allocations in the Bay Area and the future of the pipeline?
Me, you want to do that one? You want me to do it? Okay, so we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. The bond rounds, which used to be first come, first serve, over the counter, you could basically make an application at any one of their 6 rounds in the year and get an allocation of tax exempt bonds and 4% credits. What happened, the good news is that we had cities throughout California pass billions of dollars of local resources to build affordable housing, and we had the state pass several billion at the same time. And all of our construct assumed that we would be using tax exempt bond and 4% credits. We didn't really do the math, to be quite honest, on whether or not there would be enough tax exempt bond capacity to go around. And so we are now oversubscribed 3-to-1. And the current construct for allocating the resources has a priority for high opportunity areas, which is driven largely by school districts. So what we saw happen, we were the fortunate recipient on appeal for a project in San Jose, but what we saw happen is that projects in some of the larger cities San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland did not get funded in the first round this year because of that particular designation. So you were either 100% homeless or you were in a high opportunity area and nothing in between. And so, and the state's really grappling with how do they allocate these funds throughout the state, because there's big demand in LA. You know, everybody has the problem. Everybody has great projects. This is not that there are not a ton of worthy deals. It's just that there's a lot of money in the system at the local and state level and not enough money in the federal system. So there is a new tax bill out there for the tax credit that would lower what's called a 50% test to 25%, which would allow for the bonds to go further. And so we have been working very hard with the California delegation on this. Senator Padilla just signed on as a co-sponsor last week. We urge you all to keep this at the top of your priority lists. Very, very important to our ability to move the pipeline.
And Lynn, if I'm correct, that there's also the kind of an added layer of the tiebreaker being based on housing costs or bond request, and that has penalized high cost areas like San Francisco and Oakland and the Bay Area as well, which is
yeah, that's the flip side. I mean, we actually got our San Jose project funded, luckily on appeal, but it was a squeaker on the tiebreaker. We lost by $36 on the tiebreaker kind of thing. It was really crazy. And so I do think high cost areas suffer. And Jonathan, to your point, high cost structures, these buildings with parking garages, and there's big cost tests here. So there's all these challenges around trying to build the most cost effective projects you can, but you know, you're putting a parking podium in, you're not going to be the cheapest building out there. And so I think it's really a big challenge for us to try to come up with ways to manage costs. So I'm on the TCAC working group to recommend the new system for the treasurer next year. And there's this conversation around public policy needs and goals and cost, and whether there should be a split pool. I mean, so there's been a lot of conversation around how to grapple with this, because the high cost areas are also high job growth areas. So they're high opportunity areas under a different kind of definition. So we really do need to solve for this. Somebody wants to know the bill number. I don't know the federal bill number. It's the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Improvement Act, but I can, I'm sure SB at Home can send it out as a follow-up if folks are interested.
So I think we're going to need to move on, right, David? I think I got the hook. So not that we couldn't continue to talk forever on this topic, but I think there are a few things that SB at Home wants to do before we close. Or do we have time for one more question? I'm looking at David. Oops. It looks like he's on mute. So, oh, good. There's the MPH analysis on some of the bills. So some of the bills just came up quickly. So
Libby, go ahead.
Leslie,
go
just
ahead.
go. I'm going to do one more last quick question, and then I know you have I think a poll that you want to do. So I thought this was a really good question. So what do you think of using underutilized commercial and church properties for affordable housing? And are you deploying any of these or trying to do rezones on any of these kinds of properties right now? Any of the panelists?
I've been using underutilized commercial properties for many years. I think others have too. There's not a, I think retail is going to offer huge opportunity. I know San Leandro, when you look around the region, they're looking at Bayfair Mall and have been doing specific plan level work to really rezone. We have Valco here in the Valley. That's, that site has been of much controversy, but Sandhill is moving forward to reuse a very large parcel that was commercial retail. And then there's going to be office buildings, right? Nobody really knows what's going to happen to that space, how many people are going back to work and whether you're going to have surplus buildings. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And then we have several projects with churches. And I think that is also a place where you're going to see a lot more opportunity. It's just tricky that churches are not super sophisticated. And so doing a real estate deal with and they're usually run by committee. So it's different to work with a church than it is to work with somebody selling you their office building.
And it can also be a parking situation too. If you're trying to integrate the church back into the development, then you have this parking demand, right, for few major events, right, during the week, but then, the parking's, do you build the parking? How do you share the parking? What do you do?
I would just jump in and say, I think it's key. It's certainly the underutilized commercial. And I know I think SB6 is trying to tackle that. So, folks who are interested in this, I would go ahead and support that. I think the issue is, doing any kind of rezoning is just very challenging from an entitlement standpoint, the whole approval thing that we talked about earlier. So you have to be really careful about doing that. And then secondly, I think the term underutilized is kind of a relative term because could be a cash flow coming out of that property that, a seller is not willing to sell for less than, even though it looks like, the property's not really performing very well. So there's a bunch of things to think about that, but particularly it's just really, if it's not zoned for housing, it's just very, very, very challenging to get something rezoned for housing.
This is where the cities in the audience could really help, right? Thinking about specific plans, thinking about how the cities do the rezoning in their general plan amendments or when they're doing their housing elements. If they can change the underlying zoning or create their commercial zoning in a way that allows for this kind of an alternative, it makes it so much easier for all of us. And so, I think where we've had the most success is where cities have done corridor planning and really set the zoning for us. Because Jonathan's right, a zone change, it's brutal to do a general plan amendment time-wise.
And you can't use a lot of the streamlining legislation, right? If you don't have the underlying zoning.
Not conforming. No, I completely agree, Linda. I think a lot of progressive cities have seen opportunity sites in these malls. And I think the challenge too is that, if they're used to the sales tax, the cities, and all of a sudden now you're going to turn it into housing, it's not the same sales tax. So, but I think it's really looking at how can you better utilize the entire site. And can it afford more density? And then you start getting at that synergy between housing and retail and potentially jobs and having a little bit more of that, opportunity for, 24/7, or whatever the new phrase is. I think someone told me 18.6 or something like that. Anyway, but there's opportunity for synergy. And I think, anything infill, anything within the existing, and again, if we go back to AB 1401, if we can remove parking requirements from all those individual uses, that's another really huge thing. It also will have the opportunity to transform how we have parking today. So there could be a whole digital market for parking. As we know right now in San Francisco, you go to your app and you pick a parking spot in someone's building. It really, I think the future of parking is going to be similar to that. So I think, it's going to unlock sort of its locational base, on-site base, parking will be a lot more flexible. I think we'll have a lot more opportunity to really revamp our existing urban, infill cities and towns if, cities start to lay the groundwork for the development to come in and take that on. But if you guys can help us with the, all that entitlement work and get that CEQA clearance ready to come right in there and make it happen for you.
It's a great way to end this panel, and our time has come to a close. I don't know if SV at home wants to run a quick poll right now. A few simple questions. Great. And thanks to everyone for filling out the poll. And while
you.
you're doing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you, panelists. Really appreciate all of your expertise.
Thanks for having us. Happy
Thank
Affordable Housing
you
Month.
so much. Yeah, and remember next Friday, May 21st at this exact time, we're looking forward to a discussion on innovative government solutions to our housing crisis, featuring elected officials alongside nonprofit and government leaders. Please RSVP via SV at Home. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.